James Carter sat on the edge of his bunk in the dimly lit prison cell, staring at the cracks spreading across the concrete wall like veins. At 34, he was a man whose life had been defined by bad luck and worse choices. Growing up in the industrial outskirts of Pittsburgh, James had always been the quiet, capable type, the guy who could fix anything with his hands and always found solutions where others saw dead ends. He wasn't a bad person, but life seemed determined to convince him otherwise. James's childhood had been hard. His father, a steelworker, died in an accident at the mill when James was just 8. His mother worked double shifts as a nurse to keep the family afloat, leaving him to fend for himself. By his teenage years, James had become the go-to guy for fixing broken engines and solving small-town problems. But while his mechanical skills earned him respect, his quiet nature made him an easy target for blame when things went wrong. At 28, James was accused of a crime that he didn't commit. A botched robbery at the auto shop where he worked had left 2 men dead, and James had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Circumstantial evidence, his fingerprints on a wrench, a witness who misremembered details, painted him as the perfect scapegoat. With no resources to fight the case and a public defender who cared more about clearing their caseload than proving his innocence, James was convicted and sentenced to life without parole. Prison life hadn't broken him, but it had changed him. James kept to himself, observing every detail of the world around him. He didn't pick fights, but he didn't make friends either. His sharp mind and quiet demeanor earned him respect from some inmates and indifference from others. What they didn't see, however, was the fire burning inside him, the refusal to accept that his life was over. When James stumbled upon a faded map in the prison library, his heart skipped a beat. The map showed a series of old tunnels beneath the city, remnants of an abandoned infrastructure project from decades ago. One tunnel seemed to connect the prison directly to the downtown district. For the first time in years, James saw a path forward, a way out of the hellhole he'd been trapped in. Escape wasn't just a fantasy anymore. It was a plan. James Carter didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure. The tunnels beneath the prison were his best chance at escaping a life sentence. What he didn't know was where they led or how to confirm his suspicions. The fragmented maps and fading marks he had discovered told him little, and he needed more. He decided to take a calculated risk. He started asking questions. Not directly, of course. You couldn't survive in prison by revealing your hand too soon. Instead, James began dropping subtle hints to the right people, weaving his curiosity about the tunnels into casual conversations. His first lead came from an older inmate, Frank Bones Harris, who had been locked up for decades and seemed to know every inch of the prison. James approached him during yard time, striking up a conversation about the prison's history. "You've been here longer than anyone, Frank," James said, keeping his tone light. "Ever hear about those old tunnels they say are under this place? Used during the Prohibition days or something?" Frank gave him a sideways glance, his expression unreadable. "Maybe I've heard some stories, maybe I haven't. Why do you care?" James shrugged, leaning casually against the fence. "Just something to pass the time. Figured a guy like you might know a thing or two." Frank didn't answer right away, but after a moment, he smirked. "If you're asking about tunnels, you'll need someone smarter than me to help you figure out where they go." Frank's comment pointed James in a new direction. He needed someone who could think critically, maybe even someone with a knack for puzzles or architecture. After weeks of observation, he found his target. Terrence "Specs" Bailey, a former engineer serving time for embezzlement. Terrence was quiet and kept to himself, often seen sketching elaborate designs on scraps of paper during free time. James approached him in the library one evening, taking a seat across the table without asking. Terrence glanced up from his sketch, raising an eyebrow. "Mind if I sit?" James asked. "Already did," Terrence replied dryly, returning to his work. James leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You ever hear about the tunnels under this place?" Terrence froze for a split second before setting his pencil down. "What do you know about them?" "Enough to think they're real," James said. and enough to know I need someone like you to help figure out where they go." Terrence studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Even if they're there, you're not getting out of here with a shovel and a prayer. What's your angle?" James smirked. "That's where you come in. I think one of those tunnels leads somewhere important. I just need proof." Over the next few weeks, James and Terrence worked in secret, using Terrence's knowledge of structural design and James's ability to gather scraps of information from other inmates. They pieced together a clearer picture of the tunnel network. James traded cigarettes and favors to learn bits of history from the older prisoners, while Terrence used their findings to sketch detailed layouts of where the tunnels might lead. The breakthrough came when Terrence pointed out a pattern in the reinforced sections of the western tunnel. "Look at this," he said, tapping his pencil against the sketch. "These kinds of supports aren't just for keeping dirt out. They're made to hold weight. Serious weight." "What kind of weight?" James asked, leaning closer. "Vaults," Terrence replied, his voice firm. "I'm telling you, this tunnel leads right under the bank. It's the only thing that makes sense." James's heart raced as he processed Terrence's words. The tunnel wasn't just a path to freedom. It was a golden opportunity. If they could break that through the ceiling at the right spot, they wouldn't just escape. They'd walk away with enough money to disappear forever. The pieces were falling into place, but James knew they had to act carefully. The more people who knew about the plan, the greater the risk. For now, it was just him and Terrence, two desperate men trying to outsmart the system. And as James stared at the rough map they had created together, he couldn't help but feel that his life was finally starting to move in the right direction. James knew getting to the basement undetected was one thing, but staying there without raising suspicion was another entirely. The team couldn't afford even a sliver of doubt from the guards. It would ruin everything. So he crafted a detailed plan to create both a legitimate reason to be in the basement and a way to ensure the guards wouldn't interfere. The basement was used primarily for storage and maintenance, rarely frequented by guards unless something required repairs. James decided to turn that neglect into an advantage. He had Sparks rig one of the prison's laundry machines, an old sputtering beast that frequently broke down, to create a small but persistent electrical issue. Sparks made it look like a genuine malfunction, something subtle enough to need consistent oversight but not so severe as to raise alarm. James then approached the guards with a proposition. Using his reputation as a quiet, cooperative inmate who rarely caused trouble, he volunteered to lead a small crew to help maintenance workers with laundry repairs in exchange for extra time outside his cell. The guards, always eager to pawn off boring tasks, agreed without much thought. To make the arrangement official, James got the prison's overworked maintenance supervisor to sign off on the idea, framing it as a cost-saving measure. With that, James, Sparks, and Mike were officially allowed to spend time in the basement under the pretense of fixing the laundry equipment. Once in the basement, they needed to ensure no guards would come snooping. This required two strategies: distraction and deterrence. Frank, with his decades of experience navigating prison life, was instrumental. He planted rumors about contraband smuggling in the west wing of the prison, leading the guards to focus their attention on daily searches in that area. These searches not only kept the guards preoccupied, but also gave the team a predictable pattern of when the guards were least likely to patrol the basement. Sparks rigged a fake electrical hazard sign near the entrance to the basement, warning of live wires and potential shocks. Using leftover paint and some scrap metal, he created a convincingly official sign that even the laziest guard wouldn't want to ignore. Sparks also short-circuited a small junction box near the door, causing the lights to flicker ominously whenever anyone stepped too close. The guards, already disinterested in the mundane task of overseeing laundry repairs, avoided the area altogether. Inside the basement, James and his crew worked in shifts. Sparks and Mike took turns tinkering with the broken laundry machines, making just enough noise to maintain the illusion of repairs. Whenever a guard did wander by to check on them, they'd see Sparks fiddling with wires or Mike hauling parts across the room. The guards, bored and uninterested, never bothered to look further. The digging itself was hidden behind a stack of old supply crates that they rearranged to create a makeshift barrier. Using tools stolen from the maintenance shop, Mike and James dug into the wall behind the crates, carefully removing dirt and stone while leaving the surface intact. Each day, they carried the loose soil back to the yard in small amounts, scattering it during their outdoor breaks. To ensure no one questioned their extended presence in the basement, Sparks set the laundry machines to fail at carefully timed intervals. Every few days, a new problem would arise: an overloaded motor, a jammed belt, keeping the guards convinced that the repairs were ongoing. James also instructed Frank to keep tabs on any guard who seemed suspicious, ready to provide an alibi or distraction if needed. It was a delicate balancing act, but over the weeks, the team carved out a hidden entry into the tunnel network. By the time anyone might have thought to question their activities, they were already deep into the next phase of their plan, navigating the tunnels toward freedom and, unknowingly, a fortune. As James and his team slipped into the tunnel, the timed fight orchestrated by Frank erupted in the west wing of the prison. It wasn't just a scuffle. It was chaos, designed to draw attention and hold it for as long as possible. Two rival groups, each with grudges fueled by planted rumors, clashed in a flurry of shouting and fists. The guards rushed to contain the riot, pulling alarms and locking down cell blocks. The blaring sirens echoed through the prison, ensuring all eyes were focused far from the basement. Frank had coordinated every detail. Earlier that day, he had quietly stoked the tension between the groups, whispering lies about stolen goods and insults to spark resentment. When the first punch was thrown, it set off a chain reaction exactly as planned. Frank positioned himself in the thick of it, keeping the fight heated while ensuring it didn't spiral completely out of control. The team in the basement relied on this distraction to buy them time. Sparks had rigged the lights to flicker ominously, adding to the guards' reluctance to enter the area. Meanwhile, James led the group through the dark tunnel, their movements coordinated and silent. Every minute the fight dragged on above was another minute they had to work toward their freedom. Back in the West Wing, the guards were overwhelmed. The warden, furious and caught off guard by the sudden riot, called for reinforcements from the East Wing and temporarily halted other patrols. This gave James's team the window they needed to breach the final section of the tunnel. As the fight reached its peak, Frank deliberately allowed himself to get caught by the guards. Bloodied and bruised, he let them haul him to solitary confinement, where he played the role of the tired troublemaker. This bought the team more time, as the guards now believed the source of the prison's chaos was contained. No one noticed the missing inmates yet. By the time the guards resumed their rounds and discovered the empty cells, James and his crew were well into the eastern tunnel, their escape perfectly timed with the riot's chaotic aftermath. The fight was the linchpin of their plan, a masterstroke of timing and manipulation that turned the prison's strict routines into their greatest ally. The air in the tunnel was damp and heavy as James and his team reached the crossroads where the tunnel split into two distinct paths. Their breaths came in short gasps, flashlights flickering on the ancient, crumbling walls. One path veered to the west, lined with rusted beams that seemed to whisper of reinforced structures and heavy machinery. The other sloped downward into darkness, its destination a complete mystery. "All right, we're here," James said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "This is the junction. We make the call now." Mike wiped sweat from his brow, glancing down the darker tunnel. "What's the deal with that one? Doesn't look like anyone's been through there in a century." "It probably hasn't," Terrence muttered, shining his light down the western path. "But this one, it's reinforced. I'm telling you, James, it's not just coincidence. This is where the bank's vault is. It's gotta be." Sparks squatted near the intersection, his fingers tracing the cracks in the floor. "You sure about that, Specs? The other tunnel might lead somewhere safer. If we get caught up in alarms or something, we're done." James's flashlight flicked between the two options. The tension was thick, every decision feeling like a life-or-death gamble. He knew the western path was the key to freedom and a fortune, but the unknown route might offer safety, a clean exit with no complications. "Specs," James said, turning to Terrence, "if we take the west tunnel, how sure are you it's the bank?" Terrence hesitated, running his hand along the rusted beam overhead. 80%, maybe 90. These supports aren't just for show. They're built to hold weight, like a vault or a storage facility. But I can't guarantee there's no security. James nodded slowly. He turned to the others. "We stick to the plan. West tunnel. We didn't come this far to settle for just freedom. If it's the bank, we take what we can and go. The team moved cautiously, their flashlights illuminating the reinforced walls as they delved deeper into the western tunnel. The air grew colder, and faint vibrations beneath their feet hinted at something massive above them. "Feel that?" Sparks whispered, stopping to press his palm to the wall. "Generators, this is it. We're right under something big." James motioned for them to keep moving. The tunnel narrowed slightly, forcing them to crouch as they navigated debris and rusted metal. After another 100 feet, they reached a dead end. The ceiling here was thick concrete, reinforced with steel rods. Terrence tilted his head, listening closely. "This is it," he said, his voice low but certain. "We're directly under the vault." "All right," James said, dropping his bag and pulling out the tools. "We breach here. Sparks, you monitor vibrations. Any sign of an alarm, we back off." Mike and James worked in tandem, using a modified drill and a crowbar to chip away at the concrete. Each strike echoed faintly, but the thick walls muffled most of the sound. Sparks rigged a vibration sensor to alert them if the structure became unstable or triggered any hidden alarms. For hours they worked in near silence, rotating shifts to avoid exhaustion. The air grew heavier, filled with the metallic tang of sweat and rust. Sparks occasionally checked his makeshift monitor, giving them the all-clear to continue. Finally, with one last blow, the concrete cracked, revealing a faint gleam of metal. Terrence leaned in, examining the exposed surface. "That's it," he whispered. "That's the vault." As they began clearing the remaining debris, Sparks's monitor beeped faintly, a low, insistent tone. He froze, his face pale. "We've got vibrations," he hissed. "Something's moving above us." James's heart raced. Could it be machinery? Maybe. Or it could be security, Sparks replied, glancing nervously at the ceiling. "We don't stop now," James said firmly. "We're too close. Keep working, but be ready to pull out if we have to." The team worked faster, the tension mounting as the vibrations above grew faintly louder. Each movement felt like a gamble, but finally they breached the final layer. A small section of the vault's floor opened up, revealing rows of neatly stacked cash bundles. "Holy shit," Mike whispered, his eyes wide. James didn't hesitate. "Take what we can carry. No more, no less." As they loaded their bags with cash, the faint vibrations became unmistakable. Footsteps, moving methodically above them. Sparks' monitor lit up, signaling an increase in activity. "Guards," Sparks muttered, his voice tight. "They're doing rounds. We've got to go now." James nodded, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "We're done here. Back through the tunnel, move." The team retreated quickly, leaving the vault intact but noticeably lighter. The vibrations continued above them, but they moved swiftly through the western tunnel, retracing their steps to the junction. "Now what?" Mike asked, his breath ragged. James glanced down the darker, sloping tunnel. "We take the unknown path. It's our only shot at shaking them." With no time to debate, the team plunged into the darkness of the second tunnel, leaving behind the echoes of their break-in and the faint hum of alarms beginning to sound in the distance. The second tunnel was colder, damper, and far less stable than the western one. The air grew thick with the scent of wet earth and decay as the team descended, the light from their flashlights cutting weak beams into the suffocating darkness. Every step was a gamble, and the ground beneath their feet was uneven and slick. "Watch your footing," James called back, his voice steady but low. "This tunnel hasn't been used in decades." Behind him, Sparks muttered, "Feels like it could collapse any second. You sure about this, James?" "We don't have a choice," James replied. "The west tunnel's compromised. We stay here and we're caught. Keep moving." The sound of their boots echoed in the confined space, mingling with the faint rumble of something above. Machinery or pursuit, it wasn't clear. They pressed on, but as they rounded a curve, a section of the ceiling ahead began to crumble. Mike shouted a warning, pulling Sparks back just as a cascade of dirt and debris crashed down, blocking their path forward. "Shit!" Sparks exclaimed, coughing as the dust settled. Everyone okay? James asked, scanning the group. Yeah, Mike grunted, but that's a dead end now. James cursed under his breath, shining his flashlight back the way they came. We go around. There has to be another offshoot. Terrence, who had been quiet, pointed his flashlight at the wall to their left. Wait, look at this. The beam illuminated a faint outline in the dirt, an old, sealed hatch partially obscured by rubble. Sparks knelt to inspect it, brushing away the debris. It's reinforced. Could be an emergency exit from when these tunnels were active. Can you get it open? James asked. Yeah, but it'll take time, Sparks replied, pulling out his tools. Back in the prison, the alarm had spread. Guards swarmed the basement, discovering the tunnel entrance and the makeshift digging operation. The warden was livid, barking orders to send teams into the tunnels immediately. How far could they have gotten? One of the guards asked. Farther than they should have, the warden growled. I want them found now. 2 search teams entered the tunnels, one heading west toward the breached vault and the other toward the eastern descent. The guards moved methodically, their flashlights cutting through the dark as they followed the tracks left by the escapees. Sparks worked with tense precision, using a modified wrench to loosen the rusted bolts on the hatch. Behind them, the faint echo of voices began to carry through the tunnel, guards closing in. Hurry up, Mike urged, gripping his bag of cash tighter. I'm going as fast as I can. Sparks shot back, sweat dripping down his face despite the cold. James turned, his flashlight aimed back down the tunnel. The sound of boots grew louder, closer. We don't have time, Sparks. With a final twist, the last bolt came free, and the hatch groaned as it opened. Sparks kicked it inward, revealing a narrow passage leading upward. Go, James ordered, ushering the team through. They climbed quickly, Sparks sealing the hatch behind them as best he could. The new passage was tighter and steeper, but it led upward. A good sign. The team emerged into what appeared to be an old drainage facility, long abandoned and overgrown with weeds. The faint glow of moonlight filtered through cracks in the dilapidated structure, and the distant sound of rushing water echoed around them. James scanned the area, his heart pounding. We're outside the prison perimeter. This leads to the river. How far to the drop point? Sparks asked, already stuffing his tools back into his bag. Half a mile, maybe less, James replied. Let's move before they catch up. They slipped into the shadows, staying low as they navigated the overgrown path toward the riverbank. Behind them, faint shouts echoed from the tunnels, but the guards hadn't reached the hatch yet. Reaching the riverbank, they found the small inflatable raft James had stashed weeks earlier during a work detail. It was crude but functional, and it would take them downstream to a safe house outside the city limits. As they pushed off into the water, the faint sound of sirens carried on the night air. The prison was in chaos, and the authorities were mobilizing a search. But for now they were free, the river carrying them away from the nightmare they had left behind. Sitting in the raft, James glanced at the duffel bags full of cash and then at his exhausted team. This isn't over, he said quietly. They'll come looking, but we've got a head start. Sparks nodded, staring out at the dark water. Let's make it count. The raft drifted silently into the night, the team disappearing into the shadows as the city receded behind them. As dawn broke over the city, chaos erupted at Central Trust Bank. The vault breach had been discovered just hours earlier, and the news sent shockwaves through the bank's upper management. Security footage from the vault revealed nothing but faint vibrations captured by sensitive alarms that had triggered too late. The breach was surgical, precise, and untraceable. But what caught everyone's attention was the method: access through forgotten tunnels beneath the city. The revelation sent the bank's head of security, Linda Marshall, into action. She immediately contacted the prison warden, demanding answers about how such a breach could have occurred. "You're telling me they broke into our vault through tunnels underneath your prison?" she said, her voice sharp and incredulous. The warden, already furious at the prisoner's escape, bristled. "That's what it looks like. But this is as much a surprise to us as it is to you. My men are already in the tunnels and we've mobilized search teams across the city. You'll need more than that," Linda snapped. If they found their way into those tunnels, someone knew about them, and we need to find out how. Unbeknownst to the warden, one of the prisoners, an opportunistic inmate named Victor, had slipped a note to a guard during the chaos. Victor had overheard fragments of James's conversations with his team about the tunnels. Though he hadn't known the full plan, he pieced together enough to recognize the potential for leverage. The note, delivered to the bank's security team, read, "Check your history. The tunnels were never sealed properly. Someone inside knows. Pay me, and I'll tell you what I know." Linda received the note that morning and immediately called a meeting with the bank's executives and the warden. "If this is real," she said, holding up the note, "then someone either leaked this information to the prisoners or the tunnels were never as forgotten as we thought. Either way, we need answers. And fast." A task force was quickly assembled, comprising members of the bank's security team, the prison's investigative unit, and local law enforcement. Their goal was twofold: recapture the escaped prisoners and uncover how they learned about the tunnels. The first step was to interrogate Victor. Under the promise of reduced time in solitary and possible favors, he revealed what he knew. James Carter had been the mastermind, and he had spent weeks researching the tunnels in the prison library. "That's where it started," Victor said, smirking. "But Carter? He's smart. He didn't stop there. He had people, smart people, helping him. If you're looking for how he pulled it off, you'll need to start with whoever helped him dig up the details." The prison warden ordered a full review of library records, looking for anything Carter might have accessed. They found fragments of old blueprints and historical documents, but it wasn't enough to explain how he connected the tunnels to the bank. That's when Linda had an idea. What if he didn't just find this information? What if someone provided it? The team began tracing leads outside the prison, looking into construction companies, city planners, and anyone who might have knowledge of the tunnels. Old archives at City Hall revealed that the tunnel system had been part of a larger infrastructure project decades ago, overseen by a now-defunct engineering firm. The firm's records showed connections to both the prison and Central Trust Bank, an overlap that caught everyone's attention. As the investigation unfolded, the search for James and his team ramped up. The task force shared resources, coordinating their efforts to track the escapees. Bank security tapped into local surveillance systems, monitoring for any unusual transactions or sightings, while the prison's guards worked with police to comb the city. The unified effort began closing in, and tensions rose on both sides. Linda, driven by the need to protect the bank's reputation, pushed her team relentlessly. While the warden saw the escape as a personal failure he was determined to rectify. "They won't get far," Linda said during a meeting with the task force. "The city's on high alert and they're carrying stolen cash. Sooner or later they'll slip up." The hunt for James and his crew was underway, with every resource pointed at tracking their movements and uncovering the truth about the tunnels. James might have escaped the prison, but he was far from free. As the task force dug deeper into the origins of the tunnels, James and his team were already moving to cover their tracks. They had split up after reaching their safe house, each taking a portion of the cash to reduce the risk of being caught together. James kept the largest share, knowing he was the mastermind, and ultimately the one the authorities would target first. Back at the prison, Linda and the warden pressed Victor for more information. Under increasing pressure, Victor revealed that James hadn't worked alone. He had enlisted the help of Terrence Bailey, the former engineer. The warden, now furious that he hadn't connected the dots sooner, ordered an immediate review of all inmates with engineering backgrounds. Linda, meanwhile, focused on the tunnels themselves. The city archives revealed that the engineering firm that built the tunnels had gone bankrupt in the 1970s, leaving their projects incomplete. Among the abandoned records, Linda found a series of schematics showing direct connections between the prison, the bank, and other key infrastructure. What stood out was a handwritten note on one of the schematics. "Vault access reinforced. Use east route only in emergencies." This note confirmed her worst fear. The tunnels had been known to some as a potential security risk, but no one had acted on it. She immediately contacted her team at the bank, instructing them to overhaul the vault's security systems and seal off the tunnel permanently. "James, Ever the strategist anticipated that their escape route would be discovered. Before splitting up, he instructed Sparks to rig the tunnel entrance with a timed collapse, ensuring no one could follow them without significant effort. By the time Linda and the warden's men reached the junction of the tunnels, the entrance to the eastern path had caved in, leaving them with only the blocked western route toward the vault. "Smart bastard," the warden muttered, staring at the rubble. "He's bought himself more time." "But not much," Linda countered. "They're out there, and they've got millions in cash. They can't hide forever." The first major lead came when Sparks, ever the weakest link in the group, made a mistake. He tried to use a portion of the stolen money to buy fake IDs in a nearby town, unaware that the serial numbers on the bills had already been flagged. The alert went straight to the task force, and within hours local law enforcement had picked up his trail. Cornered in a dingy motel, Sparks spilled everything under interrogation. He revealed their escape plan, the safe house location, and the identities of the other members of the team. While Linda and the warden were relieved to have a lead, James had already anticipated Sparks might break. Knowing the authorities were closing in, James devised a risky plan to throw them off. He deliberately used some of the stolen cash in a high-traffic area, leaving a trail that led to a decoy location. Meanwhile, he and Mike moved to a secondary safe house, carrying the majority of the cash with them. Terrence, now fully aware of the risk, decided to go his own way. He took his share and disappeared into the night, leaving James and Mike to figure out their next move. Linda and the warden worked tirelessly, following every lead Sparks provided. They raided the first safe house, finding only remnants of the team's plans and a small portion of the cash. The discovery fueled Linda's determination. "They're running out of options," she said. "The net's closing." But James was always one step ahead. He knew the task force would eventually track his movements, so he set a final trap. Using the decoy trail, he lured the authorities to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, rigging it with distractions. A series of false clues and old equipment that appeared to link the tunnels to other criminal activities. As Linda and the warden focused on the warehouse, James and Mike slipped out of the city entirely, using back roads and stolen vehicles to stay ahead of the search. By the time the task force realized the warehouse was a dead end, James and Mike were already hundreds of miles away, heading toward a contact who could smuggle them across the border. But Linda wasn't giving up. She issued an APB on all highways leading out of the city, convinced that James's overconfidence would eventually trip him up. The story was far from over. James's careful planning had kept him ahead of the task force so far. But with the authorities tightening their grip and the media spotlight intensifying, every move carried greater risks. For Linda and the warden, it was no longer just about recovering the money. It was personal. For James, it wasn't just about freedom. It was about survival. The chase had entered its final, most dangerous phase. The final days of the chase were a whirlwind of tension and close calls. James and Mike, now deep in hiding, had reached their last planned safe house, a remote cabin in the mountains. The isolation gave them breathing room, but they knew it wouldn't last. With every passing hour, the authorities tightened their net, combing through every lead and deploying roadblocks across state lines. Linda and the warden, working relentlessly, finally caught a break. While analyzing the decoy warehouse, Linda noticed inconsistencies in the planted evidence. A piece of machinery linked to the tunnels showed wear marks that didn't align with the escape timeline. Using this clue, Linda deduced that James had deliberately lured them there to buy time. "We've been chasing ghosts," Linda said, slamming her hand on the table. "He's smarter than we gave him credit for." With Sparks in custody and Terrence's whereabouts unknown, the task force shifted focus entirely to James and Mike. Bank records flagged another series of transactions using stolen bills, this time at gas stations along a rural highway leading toward the mountains. It was enough to narrow the search radius significantly. James and Mike knew their time was running out. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. "They're going to find us," Mike said, pacing the room. "We should move. Find another spot." "No," James replied firmly. "We can't keep running. Every move we make leaves a trail. This is where we hold out." James had one last plan. Using the remaining cash, he sent a local contact to arrange transportation across the border. The deal was risky, relying on someone they barely trusted, but it was their only shot at disappearing for good. The morning of their planned escape, the task force zeroed in on the cabin. A local informant, lured by a reward, had tipped off the authorities about two men fitting James and Mike's descriptions. Linda, leading the operation, ordered a full-scale raid. As the sun rose, the sound of helicopters and sirens shattered the stillness of the mountains. James, hearing the commotion, grabbed his bag and turned to Mike. "They're here. We need to move." But it was too late. The cabin was surrounded. Linda's voice echoed through a megaphone. "James Carter, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands up." James and Mike barricaded the doors, scanning their options. Mike looked panicked, clutching his bag of cash. "What now, James?" "What the hell do we do now?" James's mind raced. He knew surrender meant life in prison, or worse. But fighting wasn't an option either. With no way out, James made a decision. "You stay here," he said to Mike. "I'll draw them away. You get out the back and follow the creek to the border. It's your only chance." "What about you?" Mike asked, his voice trembling. "I'll figure it out," James said, his eyes steely. "Now go." Reluctantly, Mike slipped out the back as James stepped onto the porch, hands raised but defiant. Linda approached cautiously, her gun drawn. "It's over, Carter," she said. "You've got nowhere left to run." James smirked, his eyes darting toward the forest where Mike had disappeared. "You think you've won?" he said. "You have no idea what you're up against." Linda's jaw tightened, but she didn't press further. The team moved in, cuffing James and securing the cabin. As they searched the area, Linda realized something was missing. "Where's the other one?" she asked. James remained silent, his smirk unwavering. James was taken into custody, his capture making headlines across the nation. The media painted him as a criminal mastermind, while Linda and the warden were praised for their relentless pursuit. But the stolen money was never fully recovered. Mike, following James's instructions, crossed the border undetected, carrying the largest share of the cash. Terrence, now living under a new identity, had disappeared entirely. In his final moments before being transferred to a maximum security prison, James leaned back in his cell and smiled to himself. He had lost his freedom, but the system hadn't beaten him entirely. Somewhere out there, the fruits of his plan were still in play, and the legacy of his daring escape would live on. The final count of the stolen money was staggering: $8.2 million in unmarked bills, taken straight from the vault of Central Trust Bank. The task force recovered only a fraction, around $1.3 million, found, scattered across the decoy locations and hidden in the cabin. The rest had vanished along with Mike and Terrence. Mike, following James's instructions, carried $5 million with him when he escaped across the border. It was enough to set him up for life if he managed to stay hidden. Terrence had taken $1.9 million before splitting off from the group and disappearing completely. Authorities suspected he was using his engineering knowledge to forge a new identity overseas. James, now in custody, refused to give any details about the missing money. When questioned, he simply smirked and said, "You think I'd leave all that cash without a plan? Let's just say, you'll never find it." The missing millions remained a mystery, fueling rumors and media speculation for years. For the authorities, the case was bittersweet. While they had captured the mastermind, the vast majority of the money had slipped through their fingers, leaving the daring escape as one of the most infamous heists in modern history.